All right. Welcome everybody back to the brain injury discussion. This is your host, Jay. Today we're going to talk a little bit about rural brain injury. Now, if you look on the service area map of where we are on the eastern shore as well as the northern neck of Virginia with Middlesex County, as well as the other counties within the northern neck. And we operate in a very rural area. And this kind of got me exploring this topic about rural brain injury. But we should get into this. And like always, the sources will be in the description below, as well as we do appreciate subscriptions, comments, and likes on this video. So we definitely encourage people to do that. We love feedback. But let's get into this. So, why should we talk about rural brain injury? Well, there's a few differences about rural brain injury. Well, rural areas don't have as many resources. And you might be thinking, well, Jay, they're more sparsely populated. And that is true. So the resources that are out there have probably more to deal with because there's not as many out there. In rural areas, we see less hospitals as well as less access to care. So the hospitals that are nearby might not be equipped to deal with a certain type of brain injury. We also see the less access to the resources. So if someone does not have a car in our service area, they will have to rely on other forms of transportation. And public transportation might not always be available or might all not always be timely or in the right time. And statistically speaking, from this source down here, you typically get worse outcomes than you do in suburban or city areas. And that could be because of the less access to resources, less hospitals, or maybe smaller hospitals, and because they don't have that many resources to begin with. So you're really dealing and starting with rural areas at maybe a deficit compared to a more urbanized area. So, with that being said, what are the challenges that someone might face if they live in a rural area? Well, we know that early resuscitation is very essential, especially with heart attacks and strokes and other very common injuries, especially with aging populations. That early resuscitation is very important. But in rural areas where roads tend to look like this, in some areas, not all, but in some areas, we might be talking dirt roads. Um, Time and distance are a factor in that. Now, if you are in a city, and we'll take Richmond as an example, you have multiple hospitals, and response time is a lot quicker. But if you are in a very rural area, that means that the response time and distance is going to be much greater. It's not going to be 5 miles. It's going to be 15, 20, maybe even 30 miles out. Specialist care is usually far away. And we talk about in brain injury world, we talk a lot with neurologists. And so think about who is the nearest neurologist to someone who maybe lives in Northumberland County, Virginia, or maybe they live in Lancaster County, Virginia, or maybe they live on the Eastern Shore. Where is the closest neurologist and how soon can they get in? Now, how soon they can get in might be a problem faced by the urban populace as well. But if that neurologist is a hour and a half drive away, for example, if they are driving from somewhere in Lancaster County and they have to go to a neurologist in Richmond, that's an hour and a half drive away, possibly more, and that's an hour and a half drive back. So we're talking 3 hours of transportation time, let alone whatever time you have during the appointment visit itself. So it takes a lot of planning into that. And so that can be one of the challenges. We could also talk about specialized medical equipment could be very far away. For example, the local hospital might have the X-ray machine, but they might not have that MRI or CT scan. They might have a neurologist nearby, but they might not have a neurosurgeon nearby. They would typically have to fly you from one of these rural hospitals into one of these urban hospitals, especially if you need some sort of advanced medical technology, including SPECT scanning. So transportation is an issue, or it can be an obstacle to care. And that's why, rural case management, we have to plan for that long drive to and from the person's residence. And so let's think about that. And not only that, roads can sometimes look like this picture over here. So let's continue. What are some differences? And I was able to find this really interesting source. And they found out that rural states tend to have a higher per capita brain injury. Now, Jay, what does per capita mean? Well, it's per population, so it's in percentage. Um, the urban areas might have more brain injury, but they also have more people. And so we're talking about per capita, which is taking it as a percentage instead of just based on the raw numbers. And they found that rural states have higher brain injuries, and they cite New Jersey as low because there's a lot of suburban areas, there's a lot of rural areas um, in other places, but New Jersey does not have that many rural areas. Versus Alaska does not have any like huge cities. They don't really have a suburban population or a big one at that. And it's a wide expanse. And so that kind of ties in with the uh, time, distance, space, all of that kind of makes sense because um, you tend to have more danger out in those areas. So um, local laws have an impact as well, or maybe the enforcement of those laws. An example is seatbelt. All right, if you're not wearing a seatbelt, chances are you're going to get a bad brain injury from a car accident. You might get a brain injury from a car accident anyways, but having that seatbelt is important. Now, if it is not enforced, or maybe the county does not have um, the law enforcement presence to address that concern, well, that could be an issue. Some states, not all, do not require motorcycle helmets, but even if they did require it via law, it still has to be enforced. And over a wide span, over one very rural county, you might not have the enforcement levels out in those areas because there's not as many troopers, there's not as much funding for the police department. That's just something interesting that this article down here noted. Is that it's sometimes not that there aren't laws on the books for seat belts, motorcycle helmets, but they might not get enforced, or maybe there's not a good way to enforce them. Also, in rural areas, you also got firearm accidents. And if you're handling a firearm, you got to treat it as a tool and treat it properly. You don't want to play with it. Firearms are not toys. And so firearm accidents can happen. We also got hunters and hunting season as well, and that can lead to death and brain injury. We also got falls and maybe unintentional falls. Some rural areas have a large aging population, and so that could be a big factor in calculating the brain injuries out in those very rural areas. And what we see in this graphic in this picture here is that there's a real difference between the rural areas and the suburban and urban areas. Usually, suburban and urban areas are close enough to medical services. They can get that advanced level of care pretty quickly. Rural, you might be up to 30 minutes away from a hospital generally, but that hospital might not necessarily have all the equipment and supplies and technology that is needed to address that brain injury. And so keep that moving forward. It would not make sense to have a SPECT scanner at a rural place if you don't use SPECT imaging there every day. But um, it might take a lot longer to get that sort of resource, especially if you live out in those areas. So let's continue on. What about hospitalizations? Well, hospitalizations, according to this source down here, and of course, sources will be in the description below. Hospitalizations are higher in urban areas. Now, you might be asking, well, Jay, isn't this supposed to be about rural brain injury? Well, yes, because um, what this really tells us is that because of the access to a hospital, they're more likely used. But we see higher deaths in rural areas. So think about it. The death rate is higher in a rural area because maybe they're farther from the hospital. Maybe the hospital isn't equipped to deal with certain brain injuries. Maybe the hospital does not have the equipment to deal with brain injuries. Maybe they're smart about it, but maybe they don't have the staffing that is needed to address the brain injury that comes into their doors. Most care, according to this article, is rendered at an urban hospital anyway. So if someone were to present at a rural hospital, chances are, if it is beyond their ability to treat, they would be medevaced or flighted out to a urban hospital where they have the staff, where they have the equipment, where they have the technology and the know-how to deal with that brain injury. They also noted that insurance was not statistically a factor, according to this study, but I'm pretty sure there could be a lot more information on that, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. So comparing the rural versus urban hospitalizations, we see that the greater access leads to more survivors, but being in the rural areas, because of the less access, it could mean higher death rates. And also, if most of the care is being done at urban hospitals anyway, because they have the technology, skill, personnel, and know-how. So what does this lead me as the brain injury case manager to conclude? Well, rural areas have the less resources and specialists and healthcare access. They also have higher rates of fatality with brain injury. The barriers to care exist, and they usually end up at urban hospitals with those resources for hospitalization. And what this all kind of boils down to is there's a lot of factors to include time, distance, access, and resources. If you were to have a stroke in a city, you're probably very close to a hospital, or at least within either a driving distance, or EMS will be there at a very quick pace. But if you're in an urban area, it may take EMS a while to get to you. It may take a while for them to get to the hospital. And it also might take time to get you to the level of care you need, probably at the urban hospital. And so this is what kind of brings me to my biggest conclusion of all of this is that it is good to know your area. It's good to know the differences between rural and urban type of brain injuries, but it's also good to prevent brain injuries, not just in the rural area, but also in the urban areas. I think there's a lot of these videos that I make that talk a lot about prevention. I think that's great. We need to prevent the brain injuries before they happen. But with that being said, that is what leads me to conclude as a brain injury case manager. Here are my references. I encourage you to look those up. It's always good information that is peer reviewed, well backed, well resourced, well researched. And with that being said, I hope everyone protects your brains. Feel free to subscribe, like, and feel free to leave a comment. Let me know about your area. Let me know if you're in a rural or urban area. Maybe there's a barrier to care I'm not familiar with. Uh, we'd love to hear about it in the comments section. But with that being said, don't forget, protect your brains.